Hello, and welcome to this episode of Inside Legal ESG. My name is Pam Cohn, and I am honored to serve as the host for this podcast series. Today, we have with us David Alfrey, who is a partner at Addleshaw Goddard. Welcome, David.
Thanks for having me, Pam. It's great to be here.
So we're going to dive right in with the questions. And first of all, congratulations on being the recipient of the Professor Paul Watchman Young Lawyer Award at the Legal ESG event last month in London. I think the reasons behind your receiving that award will become obvious as our listeners listen to this conversation. Your work is just incredible. So let's start with your work. Tell me about your career path, your background, and what put you on this journey of working in the ESG space for clients.
Thank you. And honestly, firstly, thank you for the congratulations. It's a very emotional day to receive that award. As we all know, Professor Paul Watchman was a great pioneer in the space. And being recognized for my work was very humbling. So thank you for that. So by way of quick background, so I must confess, when I started out my career, I wasn't expecting to be calling myself an ESG lawyer at all. I think it was back in 2016 that I started my career. And maybe if I start with some of the recent history and work backwards slightly. So as of 4 months ago, I've just moved to Addleshaw Goddard. And prior to that, I was at Clifford Chance for about 8 years, where I trained as a lawyer. And actually, I hail from a tiny little place far away called Pakistan, where I was essentially studying through my early formative years, moved over to the UK very much on the back of some challenging social circumstances, came in and studied law at Warwick University, from where I went on to join Clifford Chance with my training contract. And when I started there, I was very much geared to being a finance lawyer. I mean, at the end of the day, that's what big law was about, was big finance. And I went in thinking to myself there, the first day I remember walking in, and I found myself in this position where I could access literally any company in the world as a lawyer, as an advisor, some of the largest names out there, some of the most influential names out there. And I thought to myself, well, surely we can do something good with this. And I qualified as a project financing lawyer, did that for a few years, went on to litigation, where I actually supported some of the large climate litigation pieces that are out there today, including Shell, BMW, and others. And then from there, I've moved myself over yet again, 2.5 years later, into private equity and funds. And the reason for doing so at that point was a combination of frustration, but also opportunity. And I really would like to emphasize that, because I feel like for me, sustainability defined itself as the greatest opportunity of my lifetime, for sure. Mm-hmm. It was requiring us to change everything we knew about our existence. And that stretches from, yes, there's a climate crisis, but actually that means we need to have a new understanding on biodiversity. We need to have a new understanding on how people are being affected by these climate transitions. And what I found in the private equity space was there was a willingness, there was a lot of capital, there was a lot of regulation coming out, especially in Europe, around deployment of this capital to further the transition and to catalyze it. And I wanted to be part of the fun. That was the truth. And so when I walked in there, it was a new space. I sat in on various meetings where people were trying to figure out what is the methodology that we're going to start to apply. And these are unregulated space. And I think for me at that point, it was such a creative environment. There was so much energy. There was so much fear, but there was a lot of energy behind it as to how do we get this right. And you really felt that pendulum swinging in real time. There was one extreme of activism with Greta Thunberg happening. There was another extreme of, is climate change real? And in between that was caught the entire private sector. And where I found a home was actually in that chaos, because it meant that I could actually sit down with clients and find where we felt this pendulum was going to be landing. And I think it took courage. There were definitely days where I didn't have the answers. There were definitely days where the problems were far, far bigger than I had ever imagined. And every day you'd talk to somebody, you'd learn something new. There were scientists suddenly sitting in boardrooms. There were very, very emotionally challenged individuals coming in and saying, I am struggling to do my day job because of the fear of what's happening outside of my office space. Mm-hmm. And these were very real. And of course, the pandemic happened in that interim, which really brought this to the fore. And I by no means take credit for all the work that's been done in the last 20, 30 years to bring these aspects to fruition. And I was very fortunate, both being at Clifford Chance, but also being in London and in the markets that are so sophisticated, that people had done this for decades. We tried carbon markets before. We knew what worked and what didn't. We tried business and human rights. That was the guiding principles. We tried to do things in a space without a market, without the market giving it the attention it probably required at that time. And we started with Professor Paul Watchman. He's one of those people who actually stood back decades ago and said, actually, we need to start thinking about these things. Otherwise, we're going to get to a point where it's too late. And I don't like to think it's too late, because I see so much energy, especially in younger lawyers now around me, to try and fix this. And I say fix this because it is a broken space, but it is not fixing in the sense of I'm going to complain about it until somebody does something about it. It's very much, we're going to roll up our sleeves, we're going to get into the weeds of this and figure out what has to happen. And very early on in that process, I ended up working with some of the large policymakers, and that was very fortunate. But at that point, they were organizations, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about some of them, who were being looked at as beacons of hope in this chaos. They were setting the global standards. They were setting the frameworks which we were going to go forward with. And I put my hand up very young. I joined the Clifford Chance Global ESG board when I was 27. I put my hand up and I said, I want to do this. And I didn't have all the answers. And I think it's a fair confession to make that I didn't have all the answers. I don't think anyone else did either. But I was ready to jump right in head first and feel like we're going to figure this out for everybody. And it was important.
Well, and kudos to Clifford Chance for saying yes, right? It's not many law firms that that allow young associates to serve on those sorts of global boards. So that's an incredible experience.
100%. And for anyone listening to this who is in a position of leadership, that is a very important lesson, I think, in the sustainability space, is that you have to be ready to take the chance on some of these younger individuals. They are very ready for this. As much as there are traditional routes to market, we are in a point of crisis, and in a point of crisis that is going to affect the next generations to come. And I think it's super important at this stage that these individuals are brought in. And there are many ways to do it. Some law firms I've seen have put in shadow boards where the associates get to provide their feedback so that the main board can then think about it. There are others where, like myself, we are invited in to participate in the decision-making and strategy of these firms. But then there are also those who sit and work externally with third parties and allow those lawyers to do so. The Chancery Lane Project is a great example where younger lawyers are, off their own personal initiative, stepping up and saying, I think this is what the clause should say. And they will learn, as we all will, along the way, what works and what doesn't. But giving them the support to be courageous, to try and step out of the mold of a lawyer, I think is so important to address the challenges we're facing today.
Speaking of young people on boards, I was speaking to a general counsel recently, and he said to me that he looks at the makeup of the boards of his outside law firms, and if there's nobody under 40, he is not impressed. Let's just put it that way. He is not impressed.
We need to make that GC famous. That's what we need to do, Pam.
Isn't that a great line?
It is such a great line.
So obviously you had great experience serving on the Clifford Chance ESG board. I know you are also doing some work with TNFD and SBTI. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. So again, much of this is luck as much as it is courage, but I was very fortunate to be invited in to support the TNFD as it was being founded. So this is before the frameworks that are now available. So the TNFD, for everyone listening in, is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. And it is focusing on biodiversity, which I know increasingly is coming up to the agenda, but has lagged quite substantially for the past few years. And what was realized very quickly was that actually there was a need to recognize localized risk, and localized risk, not just to businesses, but to those individuals who are participating in those communities and in that environment. And so historically, we've never really understood the value of nature. And I don't say that lightly, because I appreciate there are many who have, but we often see it as a resource that we can use, monetize, and trade on. But actually, we are coming to a realization that there's a price for that resource, which is beyond what we've been paying. So I typically look at technology. We buy a mobile phone. So on average, a top-end mobile phone is $1,000, but actually the cost to the environment to bring that phone to your pocket is probably a little bit more than that. And we were starting to realize just how substantially more it could have been. And that is a combination of, yes, the biodiversity impact, but it's also a combination of how much you're paying people. Are you giving them a living standard, or are you benefiting off the struggles of others? And we've been relatively blind to those struggles because of the complexity of globalized supply chains. And what I really found interesting about the TNFD approach, and I loved being part of that process, was actually when we looked at localized risks, it wasn't that far away from human rights risks. So we were looking at the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights as a framework to inform how we deal with localized issues. And it was fascinating. And till today, by the way, that framework is out there, it's published, it's accessible, people are starting to adopt it, people are trying to align with it. Everyone will admit that it is not perfect. And that's a good lesson to learn in ESG as well. Perfection cannot be the enemy of the good. We have to start somewhere, and we have to allow the space for people to start somewhere. And I encourage those who are listening in to think about where those opportunities are, to be transparent about what you're trying to do, acknowledging where you have work to do, because that is probably the strongest defense to this. Nobody is penalizing people for continuing to cause harm in environments. What they're challenging people on is knowing that you are causing harm and benefiting from that harm without actually trying to put into place mitigations for it. And that was a lesson I learned working with the TNFD. It was also remarkable, I must confess, being part of something that global, that was going to set the new standards, that was going to start to be integrated into all the future frameworks, that was really trying to do something so novel. Absolutely loved it. SBTI, on the other hand, was something that was already in existence. So SBTI was part of the CDP, so the Carbon Disclosure Project, and they created the Science-Based Targets Initiative alongside several other founders. So there was WWF, We Mean Business, the WRI, the UN Global Compact. Again, very large policymakers in the world, very influential organizations in their own right. And what was amazing about this was, firstly, collaboration. These guys all sat down together and said, together we will find a solution to our problems. And that solution is going to be based on fact. So it's not about whether you believe in climate change or don't believe in climate change. It is about what the scientists, technically sound individuals who spent their careers learning about forestry and water systems and all the other things, had to say about what you were planning to do. And the SBTI, essentially, my work with them was largely around the governance aspects. I remain very active working with the SBTI, and they are a phenomenal bunch of people who are driven and motivated solely by greater good of the planet. And it's very humbling when you sit with them to understand exactly how they get to those points of conclusion. But what's most telling today's market, and I cannot emphasize this enough, is that if you look at any transition plan that's published, most people will ask you, is this science-based? That terminology comes from SBTI, and they remain not just the leaders in this, but in fact, I was talking to a client recently who said, I can't actually think of an alternative to it. And yet, that is what's allowing us to price in risk. That's what's allowing the capital to start to flow. That small additional verification or certification that is being provided is opening up huge opportunities, and goes back to the opportunity side, for us to sit down and say, we know where things are going, we understand the math and the science behind it, and we think this is either credible or not credible. Or if it's not credible, what more do we need to be doing? And I think that's the point of engagement that starts to materialize. So it was terribly fun working with them. And again, every day I'd walk into any of those rooms, I was instantly humbled by just how much energy, but also just how much patience these people had to be saying to the finance world, guys, thank you for thinking about us. And actually, we're here to tell you that we're here to support you. And I think I don't just think, I encourage everyone to start to speak more openly about these things. It's really important that we find ourselves in a collective and collaborative ecosystem when we're tackling so many crises at the same time.
One of the things you and I have talked about before, which has really intrigued me about your work, is the work you have been doing and have done for FIFA. You wrote a paper and did some work called The Promise of a Positive Legacy. Tell us about that, because that's really interesting stuff.
So you put me on the spot here, Pam, because I left out of my introduction all the other things I was doing, which was on the sports side. So one quick clarification, the paper wasn't done for FIFA. It was actually intentionally done independently.
Okay.
And it was done independently because I was one of the founding supporters of an organization called the Center for Sport and Human Rights. And if you haven't heard of them, please look them up. very humble organization, again, trying to do some phenomenal work. And if you could see me right now, you'd realize that behind me is a copy of the principles, the Sporting Chance principles, which are the foundation on sport and human rights. Now, the report you referenced is a result of me talking to a large number of sponsors and investors in sport. And this was in the run-up to the Qatar 2022 World Cup, Men's World Cup. And in that period, what we often got to hear was, well, we've not had enough time to engage with these problems. And this is not to say we didn't know there were problems. It's just that the bid document went in 2010 in Qatar. The UN Guiding Principles were published in 2011. So at the point that the commitments were being made, there wasn't even a guideline to work with. And at 13 years later, 10 years later, you end up with a tournament that's been hosted in the current scenarios and the current time with the current knowledge. And so it's hard for organizations that move on large horizons who have made these commitments and bids to then go back and unwind contracts and other arrangements. And what was super exciting about United 26, so that's the one taking place now in North America. So Mexico, Canada, and the USA will jointly host the next Men's World Cup in 2026, was that as part of the bid documentation, the cities, each of the cities vying to host the World Cup, actually had to publish a human rights report. And this was publicly available information. And so what I did with some colleagues at Cliff Chance was we actually sat down, read all of these reports, and tried to piece together what we felt was the opportunities now for cities, investors, sponsors, organizers, fans, athletes, to actually deliver a responsible games. Now, a lot of the commitments that will be made in these documents, of course, are ultimately commitments. And what happens in reality is a very different scenario. We've got so many things to juggle at the same time. So it's completely understandable that not everything will materialize and become fact. But that transparency gave us such a powerful opportunity. And what we did with that was we looked through these opportunities, we produced a heat map that I'm particularly proud of, which actually showed in a typical sort of heat map fashion between darker and lighter shades, what was most prescient for certain cities and what was not. What was really encouraging was the feedback we received on this report from the sponsors who, and I'll never forget this. They said, for the first time, we now have 4.5 years to address these issues. Issues that previously we had 6 months to do. And that to me is something that I am very proud of, because ultimately it meant that we had changed the excuses to solutions. This was a very young team of lawyers across our offices. They spent this time on their own pro bono hours doing this. And it was remarkable that the output was being recognized so highly. And FIFA also read through the report. FIFA has also acknowledged the report. And since then, we've just had such valuable engagement with each city across the United 26 World Cup. Everyone is really focusing now on safeguarding. They're focusing on human rights issues that can be prevented, not just mitigated. And that's ultimately the goal of ESG, is that you're trying to find ways in which you are able to utilize what knowledge and resources available to you to deliver a better, stronger games. For me, Megasport is a personal space. I am not a fan of sport. I should confess early on. I'm not a football fan either, ironically. I see sport, however, as being the only thing that I could think of that has 24/7, 365 doing social good somewhere in the world. There's a kid on some street kicking a ball in the same way there's a professional athlete training 10 hours a day to excel in their profession. And both of them have one thing in common, which is that no matter what's going on in the planet around them, it allows them to have a sense of being. It allows them a sense of community. It allows them to participate. It allows them to be active, athletic, and there's so many other advantages. And I just think if we could unlock that strength of sport across every sport, across everywhere in the world, what a world we'd be living in. And to me, that is really the world that ESG is striving for. And I can say the same thing for biodiversity. I can say the same thing for climate, that if we were able to unlock the good that is happening and celebrate the good that is happening, we'd find ourselves in a position of strength, even in our little ecosystems at our desks working every day. And so I really hope that, through that report, where we're still a few years off, I really hope that the results start to materialize. I really hope that when we get there, we're proud of it. I really hope when we look back, we don't say we had an opportunity and we missed it. And that's important. And I feel like that report is, as the title suggests, it is a promise. It is a commitment from those participating that we will do well for the aftermath of the games. The games will be great. We will celebrate them. And then when they're over, we will still be celebrating the power that sport brought into those communities. And what better way to do it than through something that everyone's willing to gather around for.
And are there plans for you to assess how well the games will be held with respect to human rights issues?
The short answer is yes, in terms of, are there plans? Are these perfect plans? Absolutely not. And I think, what I'm really encouraged by is you're seeing so many companies stepping up now, picking up this report actually and contacting and saying, hello, we saw this fantastic report. We'd like to be able to build a product for you to support this work. We'd like to build in technologies. We'd like to utilize what we now have available to us as resource, be it human capital, cash, whatever it might be, to try and get this right. It is exciting. People get excited about doing good. And I think it's, that's two sides to the coin. There's excitement about doing good. There's guilt about doing bad. And I think that the idea here is that you don't have to feel guilty. There is an opportunity here to do good. You don't have to say, I can't believe I supported my team when they were playing in an environment that was so bad. That guilt doesn't have to be there. I think tracking the improvements between Doha to United 26, from United 26 into Saudi, shows progress. That's what we're built to do, is we're trying to improve things along the way. And I think it's important that we do find a way to track it credibly. And I also think that we should be willing to accept that it won't be perfect. And it goes back to that same swinging pendulum that we started with, which is we'd like to believe there's a world in which everything is good and there is no harms caused. But we exist in a world where we have to accept that just because there's a harm, if it's a reducing harm, we have succeeded. And yes, we can always do better, and we should always be pushing to do the best we can do when it comes to these things. But let's not penalize those putting their heads above the parapet to try and make this happen. And there's no right answer. I think that's a very personal opinion that I share, and I hope that we get to a point where we start to, rather than saying, I can't believe you didn't do this, say, the next time you do this, can I come along because I would like to help you get this right? I think that's the message that we should be striving to deliver.
Well, you've mentioned a couple of times throughout our conversation, things that excite you, things that you're encouraged about. So I would love for you to comment on the current geopolitical environment, where we find ourselves, and the role of lawyers, and in that incredibly challenging environment, how can we still be hopeful? How can lawyers lead the way?
Yeah. Somehow, Pam, I knew you were going to ask me a question that was difficult. This is it. The current geopolitical situation, we are recording this for record in 2024, halfway through 2024, on the back of the UK election being done in the run-up to the US election. There are, I think the last data I heard was 64 Democratic elections taking place this year alone. That's the geopolitical situation right now. There are significant conflicts, physical war conflicts ongoing. We are at a point where resources are recognized to be finite and depleting at a rate that is not sustainable. And we are balancing so many different challenges, from sovereignty to security, resilience, access. And it is, when you sit down and put them all together, you definitely want to sit in a corner and put your head in your hands and think, oh my gosh, how could anyone or even a species try and address what we're currently going through? And I feel like that is one option. The other option is, and I paraphrase, but it was said by Barack Obama, in fact, in his 2026 address to in his 2022 address to COP26, which he quoted his mother actually to say, you can either sulk about it or you can get up and do something about it. And I think that's exactly where we are right now, which is that the geopolitical risks are immense, and we need to find a way to get through it. Sulking about it won't change anything. And I love that I'm a lawyer. It's strange when you say it out loud. Most people go into legal industry and they're like, life's easy. You just, you do the transactions, you do the stuff, and then you get paid for it and you go home and that's it. But actually, there's so much more to being a lawyer. And I've come to appreciate this the more I work with boardrooms, the more I work with investment committees, who are really people in positions of decision-making power with access to capital, who are driving supply chains and trade around the world. Lawyers carry a very unique power. And it's one that I think we have perhaps in the past discounted as being just another legal opinion. What I mean by this is when, as a lawyer, you say something in a room, well, firstly, when you walk into a room, you create a space. So for colleagues in jurisdictions like the US and the UK, we have access to legal privilege, which means we create a bubble where we can be vulnerable and be honest, be open, be transparent, and be accountable. We can confess to things not being done perfectly, and we can make commitments to things going forward. You create that space as a lawyer, and that is a virtue of being a lawyer. The second part of this is every single transaction you advise on, every single project you deliver will likely have a set of stakeholders involved. So you've got the financiers on the one hand, there's probably an asset, a company or a building or some structure of some form. And then you've got an insurance that's underwriting the asset to allow the investment to go through. None of the third parties besides the real asset itself can happen without a legal opinion. So no insurer is going to just forward funds through or give you the underwrite on the basis that the legal opinion says you can do this by law, but it's a bad idea. Because we know, and this is exactly where I think ESG lawyers are so important today in this geopolitical climate, especially, where everything is in chaos. We know and expect all political regimes to start to regulate the space. We know there are laws coming. We have no idea what the laws are going to say. That is insane for a lawyer to advise on in many ways. But we know the laws are coming. So on the one hand, you can say, well, this building is great, but actually, and you can do everything you said you want to do. You can fund it, finance it, retrofit it. But actually, there's a genuine, it is in a floodplain, which means 5 years from now, there's a good chance it's going to get hit by a flood, and you just need to be aware of it. And there are going to be regulations coming through that are going to start defining whose responsibility that flood risk is. Is it the insurers? Was it foreseeable? Yes, it was foreseeable because you've got scientists telling you it was foreseeable. So was it an act of God? Yes, it was. But was it foreseeable? Therefore, should the directors have done something about it? Suddenly, you're changing the valuation of the asset. Suddenly, you're impacting on who takes which responsibility for what. You're actually pricing in risk. You're creating obligations. You're defining certain requirements going forward as to how people should behave as amongst themselves on a social level. So how do you treat your employees? How do you ensure inclusion and diversity? How do you ensure well-being? And on the other side, you've got somebody saying, well, you're impacting the value of my transaction. Now, I know a lot of commercial lawyers listening to this will say, well, who's going to thank you for saying that the deal can't be done? It's not saying the deal can't be done. It's going into the deal responsibly aware that the deal should be done because we need to transition. And therefore, here's what we need to do to protect our clients' interests. And here's what we need to do to protect the investment and the value of the asset. And here's what we need to do to ensure that reputationally, the organization continues to thrive. These are all roles I feel increasingly need to be taken on by the lawyers. Where they become the glimmer of hope is exactly in that earlier sentiment, which is, it's not that we are blockers, we're not saying no. We cannot continue to say no as lawyers because the world needs to transition. Therefore, we need to be confident in our own abilities, in our own knowledge, in our own skills to say, here's how you can do it. And I think that is such a powerful, powerful role that we have and play that is often forgotten even by ourselves. Like, forget everyone else saying, oh my gosh, you're a lawyer, how amazing. We don't recognize our own strength and our own value in those conversations. And I think really what I'd encourage a lot of my colleagues and a lot of, I say colleagues being the entire legal landscape, no matter where you are in the world, no matter what type of law you practice, is to recognize that value that you bring to the table and really own it and run with it.
You said something really interesting. You said lawyers can't just say no. I would also say that lawyers shouldn't just ignore what they know the risks are. Because
Absolutely
I
right.
feel like at some point, somebody's going to say, what did my lawyer know, or what should he have known? When did he know it? And how come he didn't tell me about it? Right? So
Correct.
it's not only the right thing to do, but it makes perfect sense from a risk management perspective that the lawyer be the person that brings these things to the forefront so that they can be evaluated, mitigated, adjusted, etc. So the deal can go forward with eyes wide open.
Absolutely right. And very, very good clarification there, Pam, because I think it's just as easy to omit as it is to say otherwise. And I think that's exactly right. That the should they have known piece for me is a responsibility that I think as an ESG, someone who advises boards on ESG, I do not take lightly. And it does mean there's a lot of more investment in the background, which you don't see, which is you're always reading, you're always studying, you're always improving, you're learning what comes out next. And I feel like without that investment, additional investment, it cannot just be the last transaction was X and therefore we do X again. It is the last transaction was X, but the next transaction needs to be Y, and the following one will need to be Z, because that is exactly what our obligations now are converting into. Is we are a specialist set of advisors, and we need to be ready to take on that advice.
And that, frankly, is what gives me hope and why I work in ESG in the legal profession, because I think lawyers are uniquely positioned to affect change in an exponential way, unlike anybody else in their profession, right? Lawyers are at the table for every deal, every transaction, every dispute, every policy, every, there's lawyers. So if we want to affect change, we just have to mobilize the legal profession.
You've given me the Superman complex now, just by saying that. I love it. I do love it. And I think we need to take ownership of it. But that is exactly right. We are so well placed to take on that responsibility. And we should celebrate it. Well, there is no reason for us to run away from this or shy away from it. We should celebrate it.
Yep, I agree. And obviously you and I agree on a lot. And I've really enjoyed this conversation, David. Thank you so much for spending time with us. And I'm sure our listeners will really enjoy it as well.
Honestly, thanks for having me, Pam. It's been a pleasure. I listen to these podcasts regularly, and I'm just so humbled and honored to be here today. So thank you for having me.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.